Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Military Money Manual podcast. Spencer Reese here from militarymoneymanual.com. Today in the podcast, we're talking about a potentially sensitive subject, but we're not afraid of those topics on the podcast. We're talking about military divorce or divorce in the military. Our guest today is David Smith, a retired Air Force dentist turned divorce specialist and financial planner, currently based in Tennessee, where he's now the owner of Sand Oak Divorce Solutions, a certified divorce financial analyst, CDFA, a divorce financial planner, a certified QDRO specialist, and a collaboratively trained divorce financial professional, and a chartered financial consultant, CHFC, and a past board member of the Institute for Divorce Financial Analysts.
So I met David in Mill MoneyCon in 2024, where he spoke about the unique aspects of divorce in the military. And I know that you're listening to this episode today because either you're affected by divorce yourself, now you want to be better prepared for what you're about to get into if you're in this unfortunate situation or that's coming, or you're curious about how to help and support someone who's going through a divorce. So whatever your reason is, you're going to learn some valuable lessons and tips in this episode with David Smith. So David, thanks for joining us today. We want to start out with a powerful question here. What do you think is the number one myth about divorce in the military that you really want people to know the truth about today?
Sure. Thank you so much, Spencer and Jamie, for having me on. I know that was a lot you went through at the beginning, but the number one myth I would say that I really want to pass to folks is that I want them to truly believe, I want the spouses especially to truly believe that they've contributed just as much to the progress and the career advancement of the service member as a service member has, because sometimes when folks are looking at this in a divorce, they see a name on an account or it's the military member's pension or whatever, and they think, okay, that belongs to them, and it's not really part of the divorce. So a military marriage, any marriage really, I mean, that's a partnership. So everything that's been accumulated, everything that you have, that the couple has, you've done that together. So just because it has one person's name on it doesn't mean that it's not considered, in a divorce. So that's a myth I think a lot of people have is that's mine, that's yours. And, and it's not in the consideration of the big picture. Everything needs to be considered in this conversation.
I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that it's all community property. You all worked on that together, unless, and if you came into the relationship with assets or with something previously that you had a prenuptial agreement, then maybe that's been contracted out, right? Maybe that's been set aside but for most military service members, you're not coming in with substantial assets. Most military service members are getting married young or young-ish, and they're building a life together, or they're planning on building a life together. And for whatever reason, that gets derailed or that doesn't go exactly according to the plan when you said those marriage vows. And that's okay, right? Life happens, people change. I hope today, by shining a little bit of light on the situation, we can let people know that they're not alone in this. Many thousands and tens of thousands of people have gone through this before. And when we don't talk about it, Brene Brown likes to talk about, silence equals shame. And I think that when we verbalize, when we talk about an issue, we can let people realize that there doesn't have to be any shame here. Especially if you came into it with your best intentions and you're leaving it with best intentions, you can both be better off after the fact than you were during or before the fact.
Exactly. Yeah. They just need to understand the full scope of everything. Everything needs to be considered. And as you said, sometimes on occasion, the marriage and the time in the military don't exactly overlap. So it may not be 100% of this or that. And there's ways for professionals like me to help that be calculated. But the big thing, again, is if it was a partnership, it is a partnership. Everything needs to be looked at and considered.
So I know there's a lot of unique aspects of divorce in the military. It's a little different than just maybe a civilian family that's lived in the same house their whole marriage. And one of the first questions I have is, how do you know which state's rules apply to a military family who their tax legal residency for tax purposes might be different than their home of record? They might vote in a different state. They might have a driver's license. They might be stationed in one state. So you have 7 options to choose from.
There's a lot of choices. The jurisdiction question, again, obviously, I'm not an attorney. I'm a financial professional, but the jurisdiction question is a big one. So when you're looking at, if they're living overseas, obviously it's not there, but do they own a property somewhere? Do they vote? Do they have their driver's license, et cetera? where they filing their taxes or claiming as their home of record, residence of record, et cetera. And that's one of those things where I would really suggest that they reach out to an attorney early on to get that decided, because that applies, obviously, if it's the service member. If it's the spouse that might start the process, some states, generally all states are going to have a rule like if you're a resident of that state for, say, 6 months, for example. Like somebody might have parents or family live in one state. They might move there for a period of time and potentially qualify under that state's rules for them to file. So you've got that complexity of who's actually starting the process and what jurisdiction is going to control it, because that state's then rules, statutes, processes, documents, forms, everything else, it has to be considered. Calculations for child support, spouse support, are there actually formulas for that, or is it kind of up in the air and it's just whatever's agreeable? So yeah, that's a good place to start. Settlement is jurisdiction.
I'm assuming this is out of the scope of what the JAG on base would provide for military families, but is there ever a case where you don't need a divorce attorney, or is that pretty much always going to be the first step?
You're right. In the JAG folks on the base can't represent someone, but they definitely should. Whoever is considering divorce should at least have a communications or a consultation with the JAG office. Is an attorney required 100% of the time? Not necessarily, depending on the complexity of the divorce. I'm not saying that. There's a difference between folks hiring or retaining an attorney to represent them versus an attorney that they can hire as a consultant. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. They just think, I've got to go hire an attorney. When they hire them, they're thinking they're going to represent me in court. Well, court's just one of 4 or 5 different ways of getting divorced. So whether the attorney's involved or not, as far as representing them versus consulting with them, that's a different role the attorney can play. It can be a very important role, but they're definitely different. So no, not necessarily 100% of the time. It could be mediation and various other processes, but definitely consulting with an attorney, and then also having them read documents before things are filed, et cetera.
I think one thing that I've come to realize, I haven't been through a divorce myself, but I've seen several of friends and family members go through divorces in the last couple of years, is it can be amicable. Like it can be both parties can come to it in a spirit of good faith and separate in a clean manner where both parties are at least maybe not happy, but satisfied with the outcome. And you don't need to pay attorneys thousands or tens of thousands, or I've seen an example now that's getting up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars between child custody and relationship property. It doesn't have to be that way, right? If both parties can come to a mutually agreed upon agreement, and like you said, consulting with an attorney so that you ensure that someone has your back and someone who has done this before. And, I think that's the advantage to consulting with an attorney or someone like yourself, is that you have seen, for most people, it's probably their first divorce or maybe their second. And so they don't have a lot of practice doing it. But if you go to an expert who has been through more than one of these with their clients, they can say, look, this is what I've seen work well in the past, or this is what the law requires. And you just don't have that experience. And so I think this is one of those situations where, like in finances, like there becomes a point when your taxes become so complex, it makes sense to hire a CPA to help you out, at least make sure that you've been doing it correctly, even if it's just for 1 year, and then you can go back to doing it yourself. Same thing with divorce. I think it makes sense where this is one of those instances where it makes sense to bring in expert outside counsel and make sure that you're not missing something.
Right. Oftentimes, I would suggest that, and that hiring an attorney to represent someone doesn't have to be the first step. Doesn't have to be a step at all, as I just mentioned with a consulting attorney. But to really be more prepared and really be more effective in that initial conversation with an attorney, just to consult with them, if someone considers talking with someone like me or someone that can help them get full clarity of their financial picture. What are we talking about? What are the assets and debts we're talking about? How long have they been married? Are there children involved? What state, again, are we thinking about? So are they thinking about? So they're talking to the right attorney that's licensed in that state. Doing a lot of groundwork at a cost-effective rate and using someone that can focus on the financial part of it that because of their experience and expertise. And then when they go into that initial conversation, then they've got something they can actually talk about. It's not sitting there for an hour and talking about the emotional side, which I'm not saying is not important, but that's not really an effective use of their time or the attorney's time.
Yeah, I actually just had a recent example of this where a family friend passed away and the wife went in to speak with the attorney, and she spent 30 to 45 minutes just gushing about how great he was as, as a husband and as a father and as a grandfather. My friend, this was my friend's mother, my friend had to say, "Mom, he was great, but like save it for your therapist." The
Right.
therapist is a lot cheaper than the attorney. So save it for your therapist. Like, we've come in here for we need to do this specific task with this specific person. Let's get it done because they're very expensive, and let's be efficient about this. And I think that's exactly to your point, where get the emotional side of it out of the way in the first 10 or 15 minutes and then move on to the brass tacks and use other resources, therapists, your friends, your family members, to kind of deal with the emotional side of it, and just use this professional for what you're paying them to do. Because if you don't, they're happy to sit there for hours and let you talk.
The right conversation with the right professional at the right hourly rate. Just think about it that way. And and it's not just about cost. I want folks to look at bringing on professionals as a true investment in their future. It's not there. Yes, there's a cost, but don't look at it just that way. It's like, okay, I'm investing this time because many times I've seen they're going to save a whole lot in the long run by what they find out, what they maybe realize they thought they could do that they can't do. Or they've got all these details more fleshed out before they get into the discussion mode and agreeing on how to divide up property. If they haven't identified everything, if they haven't decided if it's marital or not, if they haven't decided a value and a date and what they're going to place on that, all those things before they get into the vision conversation, they're really not being effective or efficient. They're just piecemealing it. They're grabbing something and say, let's do this with that. And it's out of the big picture. You got to start with the big picture and then work into it.
One of the things an expert can help with is to understand the unique aspects of the military. We're going to go through some of them, different benefits, healthcare, SPP. The first one I want to ask about is military pension. So what are some things to watch for if someone is either about to retire or is already a retiree?
Oftentimes, a pension is talked about as being divided. A division of a pension is not the only option. What I mean by that is when you look at this value of this lump sum of money that's basically paying out consistently that monthly COLA adjusted thing for 30 or 40 years in somebody's life, they don't realize how big of a value that is. So you can actually value an asset, and then one person can get all of it, and then the other person gets something in return or to offset that. So division is not the only way. But when you talk about dividing the pension specifically, you have to consider, again, is it all marital? You have to look at what's actually divisible, because certain parts of a pension, VA disability, et cetera, are not divisible. There's the piece of it, of course, the SVP, the Survivor Benefit Program, that's an important part of the discussion. So you've got the value of all those things, and it's not DFAS or another pay center, for example. They're not just on a whim, on a phone call from a service member or an email, or are they going to do something? It takes a court order. So you have to have court orders like military retirement, pension division retirement orders that are going to split these things. There's a lot of steps, but even coming back before that, you got to have the right language in the settlement agreement. There's a ton of things to be discussed before you sign the agreement. And so all this background information needs to be known. Excuse me. And then you've got differences in active duty service members and reservists and guards members. Who collects the money when? When do they claim or do they elect their SVP beneficiary? There are so many different pieces that come into play when you're actually talking about the pension itself.
David, I want to ask, you've used the term a couple of times, is it marital or not? Can you explain what that means?
Now, some states are what's called community property states. I think there's 8 of them or so. But the difference between marital and separate property, the way that I use that terminology, let's say a couple got, married at a certain time. If they come into it with accounts that they had before the marriage and they don't commingle or mix those up, or say during the marriage, they inherit something, someone passes away and something comes to them, or there's a gift that comes to them, for example, and they keep those accounts separate, not commingling, not mixing marital money, not using that for something else and so forth. Oftentimes that can mean that they're marital and separate. If it's separate, then it's not in the bucket for division, but it still needs to be identified so everybody knows what they're going to do with it, who's going to be responsible for it, what if any action needs to be taken, who it actually still belongs to and gets awarded to, but it's not part of the property division. So that key step about characterization, I use that word, that's finding the character. Is it all marital? Is it all separate? Or is it a mix? Many times, like TSPs, the pension, et cetera, they're not 100% marital. So calculations need to be done to make sure that you're counting those things the right way.
So let me just recap it. Let's say that we valued a military pension for a service member at $1 million. And we had $1 million home in this made up scenario. You're not necessarily dividing the home in half and the military pension in half. You can say, okay, you take the home, I'll keep all my pension, for example.
Yeah, at high level, yes, generally. We had, a little bit more details of looking into it, but generally that's the case. Yes, instead of saying we have to take a knife and cut everything down the middle, or every account or IRA or, whatever, 401k has to be right down the middle. There's a lot of administrative tasks. There's a lot of paperwork. There can be a lot of other costs involved in doing that. Like me, when I'm helping folks identify everything they have, and I say, okay, once it's all marital, we figure that out. We put it in a bucket. As we start taking it out, they might say, well, all of this is going to go over here. Half of this is going to go here and here. But when you get down to the bottom line, you come equitable. In other words, it's about fair or equal numbers, all assets and debts. So that's why there are multiple ways of doing it. Some smarter than others, more cost efficient. It takes a lot less time to do certain things. And you mentioned the house. Oh, my goodness. You're talking about potentially having to refinance or assume a loan, sell it, et cetera. So there are a lot of considerations around a house.
What about, you mentioned briefly the survivor benefit plan. Is there anything unique about that where once you get a divorce, the surviving spouse is no longer eligible or anything like that?
Yeah, there's a couple of real important landmines, I call it, to consider with SBP. For your listeners, just in general, if they don't know what SBP is, it means, of course, if the service member dies first, then if they were awarded a portion of the pension, even if they're not awarded a portion of the pension, some folks don't realize that they could still be an SBP beneficiary, even if they don't receive a portion of the pension while the service member is alive. But once the service member passes away, if they die first, the surviving spouse gets nothing unless they've been named as the survivor benefit program beneficiary. A couple of key things. One is there can only be one SVP beneficiary named. I've seen situations where multiple divorces for previous spouses were already sitting in that chair, I call it, for SBP, and then you come along another divorce and that person's out of luck. They can't get in the chair because somebody's already there. Another thing, too, is that you've got to figure out who's paying the premium. It doesn't come free. There's a cost to the SBP. So you have to decide how that's going to be paid. All of these are discussions, again, that need to occur before the settlement agreement is signed. So it's, and a very important part, it just doesn't automatically come to the former spouse post-divorce. They have to fill out forms. Hey, we're military. Guess what? You got forms you got to fill out. So there's paperwork you have to submit within a certain period of time or you lose that seat. Okay, so there's timing, there's things ahead of time, and there's things post-divorce that need to be handled around SBP. I would take just a second to kind of let you guys know, if I could, just why did I actually get into this business? I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and I was a dentist, so it didn't have anything to do with finance, but I loved finance the whole time I was in. But one of the part of the reason that I got into this business, it kind of started with my own family. I had 7 divorces in my own family, one on my own, and it was my mom and my dad and my sister, and multiple times. So I had quite a bit of experience in this personally. When I moved to Florida, my last assignment, just before I got out of the military, I started looking at some statistics about divorce, and I found that Florida was really very high in a divorce rate at the time. And even where I was living was pretty high too. And so I said, there's got to be a better way of people doing this. They don't have to spend this much money. It needs to be kinder, gentler. I mean, how can they do this and keep more money in their pocket? And that's when I reached out or searched and found the CDFA, Certified Divorce Financial Analyst designation, through an organization called the Institute for Divorce Financial Analysts. And so I've been doing this divorce work for about the last 10 years. So it started back in my own history and experience of my own, and moving it forward and thinking about the whole time I was in the military. I got a couple of different designations. I got a lot of financial questions from people while I was active duty. I said, how can I combine these things? My military experience, understanding the lingo, being in it myself, and then being divorced myself, take the financial part, the divorce part, the military part, put it all together, came out with a CDFA. So that's kind of a little bit about my story of how I got to where I am now.
Another question that might come up, TRICARE. So let's say a civilian spouse, do they get any benefits? Is there a phase out period, or would I owe my soon-to-be ex-spouse anything because they lose TRICARE?
One of the first things to know is that a court can't order TRICARE. They can't. The court has no ability to do that. That falls under federal rules and guidelines. So I mentioned timing before, the importance of timing. There's several rules that former spouses can qualify or not qualify for TRICARE. And it's generally how long they've been married, how long the service member's been creditable years towards retirement, and how long those two periods have overlapped. So there's certain rules like 20-20-20, for example, or 20-20-15. One is a golden goose where they kind of get everything and get to keep it for a long time. Others, it's a transitional period of time. And if they don't meet either one of those two rules, they can go to something that's similar to COBRA. The key is that they can't just say, the court says you got to have, you get TRICARE. No, if they don't meet the rule, they don't get it. It's kind of as simple as that. Now, as far as paying for it, again, if you qualify for TRICARE for life, et cetera, I mean, generally that's going to be paid for by the former spouse because it's a reasonable, rate. So it's not like it's a have to, or it doesn't come from the court. It comes from, have I been in this place for long enough to satisfy this rule?
What about the post 9/11 GI Bill? If that's been transferred to the spouse, do they keep that in the divorce, or is that another point of negotiation?
Well, the parts of what you said are correct from a standpoint. What I mean is the transfer of entitlement, that transfer of the GI Bill benefit has to, if it's going to go to a spouse, it has to occur while they're married because it can't go to a former spouse. That's one of the things that people don't realize. They say, we'll handle that after the divorce. No, it has to be done prior to. Now, it can be, of course, also transferred over to their children. And there's different times of how they can spend that benefit and different time periods they have to use it, et cetera. But one thing, because the GI Bill benefit belongs to the military member, so they voluntarily are doing this transfer entitlement. Again, it can't be court-ordered. And because it belongs to the service member, they can also take it back, rescind it. Now, so that's where, again, I know I've mentioned it several times, but coming back to the appropriate language in the settlement agreement for these different kinds of scenarios. What if this happens? Or what if the person takes this action to do this? What does that mean needs to be done then? Or what's the consequences of that? What's the effect? What would need to take place after that?
What's kind of the, I want to say, ideal client, or when someone meets with you, what's kind of like the best case scenario outcome for anybody that you've counseled?
I personally prefer to work with folks in out of court situations. And what I mean is there are litigated cases where if you hire someone to represent you, you've got hearings, you've got judges to decide, you've got subpoenas potentially. there's a lot of requesting this and waiting and asking and waiting and forcing this and that. I particularly don't like to work like that. And I don't think that's great for families in the long run. That whole thing is just too much stress for families now as well as in the future. So best case scenario, I would love for people to consider out of court options. And I also don't do expert witness testimony. I don't testify in court. And I tell people and then in front. If they use out of court options like mediation, where they have a neutral facilitator to help them go through things, or they use a collaborative process where they actually have a team of professionals that work with them, and that's a completely out of court process, collaborative is. I personally believe that that's better for the families in the long run, that there's privacy in those processes versus the litigation. They can control the speed at how things go since there's not hearings, et cetera. They are generally going to be more cooperative and they're not subpoenas and having to wait, so forth. They're sharing documents together. It just overall cost-wise and effectiveness are with those out of court processes. I just think those are so much better. And there's actually a little video about the collaborative process on my website. People want to go there sometime and take a look at it.
I'm like kind of blown away that court is not the only option. Like I never really realized that, and not having been through one myself. And I'll have to warn my wife this episode's coming out. She doesn't think I'm researching for it. But what are some maybe practical things, the first maybe 2 or 3 things that someone should do if it's obvious they're on the path towards divorce, whether they're service member or the spouse? Are there some practical tips of gathering documents, talking to certain people, things like that you would want to share?
To reinforce this again, making that initial decision or the process they're going to follow, actually go learn about the different processes, the advantages and challenges to all of those 4, whether it's do it yourself without professionals, mediation, collaborative, or litigation, maybe like you see on TV. And there are workshops out there, educational workshops. Again, on my website, if you click the workshop tab, you can actually go and find out around the country where those workshops are being given. And that's an relatively easy way in a couple of hours to find out that information. That's one thing to do practically, is make sure you know that there's more than one option. Don't lawyer up necessarily so quickly. Another practical tip, not necessarily financially, but if there's any kind of physical, emotional, financial abuse and so forth, they should really seek a legal counsel fairly quickly and talk about that, and making sure that they know what might need to be done if there's restraining orders, et cetera. Definitely over on the legal side. But coming back to the financial, what I would say is things like considering if you don't have a credit card in your own name, maybe you go open one. If you don't have a bank account in your own name, go open one. Now, there's a difference between opening the accounts and spending like crazy and moving money around and just shifting stuff without some kind of agreement, because there's usually some type of standing order or play nice orders or status quo kind of orders that you don't want to violate. So make sure that you're talking with an attorney before you start a lot of money movement. A unique one other practical thing I think is a little bit unique that I suggest is I actually ask people to sit down and write out just bullet points, a list of important dates and places, like when did you get married? What were your duty stations, previous employers? That can help with things like looking for prior retirement accounts and pensions that may still be back there that people have forgotten about. Collecting their supporting documents like tax returns, bank statements, et cetera, but doing that in a cloud storage so you don't have this huge stack of documents just sitting around the house. Account numbers, login credentials, passwords are extremely important. Having a way to manage, your passwords, because you might be changing those quite often or a fair bit. And a lot of people don't think about that. Passwords get changed. They don't have access to accounts. So that's some of the practical things I think that somebody should consider doing.
That's a really good list. I think that's super helpful to people. And I want to ask from a slightly different perspective, a similar question. As a friend or a supervisor or a commander or senior NCO, someone in my unit, someone I care about is going through this situation, what are some things that I can do to help support them other than maybe just give them time off, make sure they're okay?
There's an awful lot of decisions, obviously big decisions to be made, really just deeply important decisions. But I look at it from this way, this perspective. A true friend or a wingman, whatever somebody wants to call someone that's there to support them, they can provide that support by simply, and I say simply, it's not easy to do, listening deeply, just listening to the person, being very empathetic about their needs, what they're going through, being available for them, and maybe even point them to some other resources to use, such as counselors, family services on base, etc. Do stuff to like volunteer, watch their children, for example, maybe help them clean the house a little bit or cook a meal or something like that to give them a little bit of breathing room, some way they can support them without necessarily saying, if they went through their own divorce, the friend, for example, well, in my divorce, I did this. This was important to me. This is the way I handled it. This is the attorney I talked to. Oh man, they were this and that for me. So it's supporting, but in a different way. And not really having them rush into anything. Again, don't just tell them, like I said, what you did in your own divorce, but it's really hard not to get involved and people want to do that. But just listen and be their support and do small things for them that can be really meaningful for them.
Yeah, that's good. I think that empathetic approach will be helpful because that's such a challenging time. And we know from the statistics, it happens a lot in America and it happens a lot in the American military. What are some of the common pitfalls that you see financial mistakes that they make during the divorce process, or people think, man, I really wish I had David on my team to help me prevent that mistake from happening?
Financial mistakes. Again, I think one, I kind of maybe alluded to a little bit before, but if you start making verbal agreements and dividing stuff before you've got your full financial picture, I just don't think that's a very great way to do that. So that process I talked about, the 4-step process and so forth of going through all that, is one way to avoid making some mistakes in the future, because the vast majority of decisions that you make in a divorce, there are no do-overs. I mean, you can't go back and fix them. When you do a property division settlement and you agree on all that and the court signs it, it's a done deal. That's it. So if you haven't identified everything, if you didn't understand exactly what you could do with certain things, or if you misclassified it, marital or separate or not, or you left things off, or you didn't consider things like taxes, financial mistakes like capital gains taxes, selling a house or a brokerage account, selling assets. I mean, those are things that financial professionals and also other professionals and attorneys can help people prevent that, so that when they go back and they look, when you get at the end of your divorce, I ask people, I hope that they can look back and tell me what they felt made it successful. Yes, it's been a hard time, but what actually came out of it that they felt was successful for them. So not stepping into things too quickly, being very clear, taking your time, truly understanding what your options are and the consequences of those financial decisions.
I just want to ask a follow-up about taxes. I'm guessing that's part of the strategy of, hey, let me keep this account so I don't have to sell and be subject to capital gains taxes, and you keep this account or things like that. But you're also going to have to switch your filing status in most cases. I'm guessing there's a lot of difficulty there. Change of tax brackets.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things about that I can help folks with is that when we're looking at that future, okay, because sometimes folks will look at a pay stub and they go, okay, this is how much I'm paying in taxes. And that's what they think, it's going to be. But that's a certain filing status. So changing in filing status, who's going to claim, if it's child tax credits, for example, other kinds of credits, claiming the child to get those particular credits. When you're dividing, say, for example, an IRA 401k, I always suggest that you consider the taxes, because it's like when you go to cash that out, there's some tax consequence to it. If you get $50,000 in a bank account, take that out, okay, there's no tax consequences. But if you get $50,000 in a traditional IRA, there's going to be some tax consequences and additional consequences if you take it out too early, maybe an early withdrawal penalty, for example. Another thing too, when folks are thinking about assets and debts, and there's a lot of annuities that are floating around, and people don't understand a lot of times they don't understand how they work. charges if you cash it out too early. What value are you actually going to use in your property statement? Do you use the value of the account? Do you use the value that is if you took it out now and there's charges, so it's a lower number? There's lots of things like that, impacts of those decisions that are going to move numbers quite a bit, from one way to the other, from one benefit or negate something to the other person.
So, David, I want to back up just a little bit. We talked about splitting a thrift savings plan, the TSP. We mentioned before the call, too, that sometimes couples have to split more unique assets like credit cards, points, and miles. So let's talk about the TSP first, and then I want to talk about splitting credit card points and miles.
Okay. So TSP, thrift savings plan, kind of similar to a 401k, military version of that. Okay, but think about this. In a relationship, if you've got a military member, they have a uniform services thrift savings account. If they're married to their spouse works in the federal government as a GS employee, there's a civilian thrift savings plan again as well. And then you also are typically going to have with a government spouse, government employee spouse, they have a pension, first pension, et cetera. So you can have multiple pensions involved. Again, when did they start? When were they accumulated? When they get married, marital, separate, like we talked about before. And I've seen situations where folks were reservists, worked in a civilian job, had a civilian TSP, then they went active duty and had their own uniform services. So they actually have two. So there could be multiple thrift savings plans that need to be looked at. There are pre-tax and Roth portions of TSP to be considered. So the tax consequences of those are different. You've got to consider loans that either been taken out, that have been taken out. How do you account for the loans when you're looking at dividing the thrift savings plan? I mentioned that when you're dividing a military pension, there's a military retirement pay division order that needs to be written and sent to DFAS to give them the order to do that. Well, there's a similar but a different name document for a TSP. It's called a retirement benefits court order. So it's not the same thing. It's a different format. There's different terminology in it. It obviously has to go to a different place. So if you split down the middle or one person gets one or the other, if there's no division of the TSP, if it's a value and offset, then there's not a retirement benefits court order, obviously. One person keeps it. If you divide it, then you need that order to make it so it can go to two people. So it's all those kinds of things. Again, it's discussion, decision, action. The discussion needs to come first. So clarity and then discussion. So a couple of other things that might be unique as far as it might wind up taking some time to actually figure out as pets, for example. Pets can really be a major source of discussion when you got multiple pets. I mean, I know of one situation where there was a championship show dog that was very expensive on a monthly basis to take that dog to events, having particular equipment, et cetera, that dog needs, or certain food and meat they have to eat. I mean, there's some things like that that can be really unique and need to be considered. All of those things to be considered. And even things like, I know you guys have a lot of conversations about credit cards and mileage points and things like that on your podcast. And so recently situations I've seen where those points can be worth $30,000 to $40,000. That needs to be considered. And even military leave. Okay, there's a value to the number of days of leave that somebody has on their LES, and that may not be looked at. And what about USAA has a subscriber savings account, and there's money actually there that people don't think it's real money, but it actually is, because it belongs to somebody. So there's all of these things like that sometimes people don't think about. And it's just talking about it, getting it down on paper, say, look, here's the things that maybe were overlooked or forgotten or didn't get discussed. Life insurance, oh my gosh, so many other things to consider. But sorry, I don't want to get too far into that.
It's so good. I've learned a ton. I think specifically the things that stood out to me as we start to wrap up, or making sure you start by taking the inventory and starting the discussions of what do we actually have, when did it start, where all we been, when did we get married. Court is not your only option. I think that's kind of a groundbreaking news for a lot of people. And then not everything needs to be cut exactly in half down the middle, and you're considering taxes. You take this, I'll take that. There's a lot of options, and that's where a professional like you can come in to help. So David, where could people find more about navigating divorce finances and learn more about Sando Divorce Solutions and how you and your team can help them through this really tough process?
Yeah, I think probably one of the best places is actually going to my website. And I know Sando Divorce Solutions is kind of a lot. That's a long business name. But I came up with that. If you think about it, when someone starts them in divorce, if you think about them walking on sand, things are uneven. It's kind of hard to get through. It's not really stable. There's a lot that's happening and you can fall and trip over something. And as you move through the process and you get, oak is more like the roots of a tree that really have more of a foundation, that are stronger for the future, that sort of thing. If you can just kind of remember, sand on the beach, oak like the tree. So sandodivorcesolutions.com is my website. I offer free 30-minute phone consultations for anybody. I just love to talk to anybody and see if I can help them or point them in the right direction as far as a resource. There's also, I typically blog maybe once a month or a little more frequently. There's some videos there as well, some other podcasts that I've done related to military divorce that are links to that website. You can find me on LinkedIn. Simply just put in David Smith /CDFA, and I should come up. And then just for folks that maybe they're looking, now I can work around the country in multiple states, but I also work with other CDFAs in other states and consult with them on military divorce cases. So if someone is looking for a CDFA, if they go to the Institute for Divorce Financial Analysts, which is institutedfa.com, and put in their zip code, for example, they can find there's CDFAs all over the country. So I'm happy to help in any particular role. It can be on a limited basis just for the military part. It could be more comprehensive if they want me to bring, all in for things. But it starts by saying, hey, we can just have a short conversation. Tell me a little bit about what's going on. I want to listen to you, answer some of your initial questions, and say, hey, if it feels like it's a good fit, we want to do this, and I can help. Because, I've been there myself. Again, I've been divorced. I went through the military, and like Spencer said, sometimes things just don't go as good as you planned, and things happen. My advice to kind of close up here is you get yourself organized. You find professionals that can actually help you understand your situation, help educate you, and help you be a lot more confident about the decisions that need to be made. So just consider that, as they move forward.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.